So, welcome. We're going to take a deep dive this afternoon into a thinker that many of us have not been exposed to before, so this should be, give us a lot to think about. But I thought actually just to get us started, I've just been aware of the whiteness of this conference. And so this afternoon I was just looking around for some way to bring something of another voice in here. And I came across a poet, an African-American woman who lived from 1880 to 1966. Her name was Georgia Douglas Johnson. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance. And so it's a short poem, but I thought it would at least bring in that voice in. It's called Brotherhood. Come, brothers all, shall we not wend the blind way of our prison world by sympathy entwined? Shall we not make the bleak way for each other's sake less rugged and unkind? Oh, let each throbbing heart repeat the faint notes of another's beat, to lift a chanson for the feet that stumbles down life's checkered street. Okay, so let me introduce Donna Orange. Donna is educated in philosophy, clinical psychology, and psychoanalysis. She has a PhD and a PsyD, teaches at NYU postdoc. Her recent books are Thinking for Clinicians, The Suffering Stranger, Nourishing the Life of Clinicians and Humanitarians, and her most recent book, The Climate Crisis, Psychoanalysis and Radical Ethics. Donna.
Thank you so much. I am quite, grateful that so many of you are here after such a long day. I'm honored and grateful. I'm also a bit intimidated by the scholars in the room because this is a very introductory kind of talk about a philosopher, kind of a philosopher theologian whom I have never heard mentioned at this conference, but I think may be interesting to many of you. And I'm extremely grateful to Claire Katz, a Levinas scholar, whom I have read and admired for years, for being willing to discuss this paper. I've called this Another Voice from Radical Ethics. What may I do? What must I do? What must I never do? And why or why not? Ethics usually taught as a calculus of justice or risk and reward in the rationalistic, individualistic, and thoroughly Western voices of Kant and the utilitarians, claims an indispensable place in ordinary human life, whatever that may be. Promises, contracts, even medical triage. In a distinctly second place, we have descriptive ethics, from Aristotle to Paul Woodruff, teaching us to ask what makes a human character good and what in human life is worth pursuing. Intuition ethics, with a long British history and now resurrected in social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, explains why people hold moral positions for which they can give no grounds whatever except that they feel so convinced. Some behaviors evoke disgust and extreme disapproval, even when we cannot explain why. Arguably, however, we once again live in times where all these normal ethics fail us. Radical ethics, our topic here, attempts to meet the challenges of what Hannah Arendt described as the dark times. Those times, these times, when everything is at stake. When, for example, human life has no value whatever to our controlling economic systems, and when our planetary home will soon be uninhabitable. Radical ethics, as the ancient prophets knew, orients everyday life but becomes crucial in emergencies. And yet, the voices of radical ethics sound strange. Can one be both a philosopher and a prophet? Most philosophers would immediately say no, and I think most prophets would say no, perhaps more slowly. Here at Psychology and the Other, however, we still wonder about such questions. Though many of us have learned the relational ethic of Martin Buber long ago, most of us know a truly radical ethical voice, primarily or only in the work of phenomenologist and Talmudist Emmanuel Levinas. Thanks to his fellow survivor of totalitarianism and liquid modernity theorist Zygmunt Bauman, whom we lost this year after a prolific and challenging old age, as well as to my Levinas teacher Simon Critchley, I have now been discovering a second border crosser who often upset rigorous disciplinarians in theology and philosophy both, the Danish Lutheran philosopher of ethics, Knud Eiler Løgstrup. And I apologize to anybody who knows Scandinavian languages because I don't know how to say these things exactly right. Bauman tells of his mid-1980s sabbatical in Newfoundland before he wrote Postmodern Ethics. Quote, ethical philosophy of the modern era, he believed, could not but reflect the legislative and order-building ambition, the defining trait of modernity. Searching the library shelves in St. John, Newfoundland, having previously found only Emmanuel Levinas to challenge traditional rationalistic ethics, he had nearly given up when he came upon a probably unread copy of Løgstrup's The Ethical Demand in English translation, where he recounts he found his lost time compensated many times over. Now he could counter the calculus of philosophers like Stephen Toulmin's so-called moral person. For both Bauman and Løgstrup, this righteous fellow, this moral person, was a dreadful person who would return John's book just because everyone must return what is borrowed. This moral person, a good Kantian universalizer, cares not two pins about John, but is merely concerned with his own fidelity to his promises so that the social order may be preserved. This is Løgstrup talking. Perhaps the most important Danish philosopher since Kierkegaard, and born in 1905, Løgstrup lived through the Nazi occupation of Denmark, taught philosophy and theology at the University of Aarhus, and died in 1981. His magnum opus, translated into English as The Ethical Demand, claims that the impossible command to love one's neighbor, as heard in Christianity, need not be linked to institutional religion or dogma, but instead must be understood humanly as four things: silent, radical, one-sided, and impossible. He believed that the basic phenomenological fact of human trust in each other, absent abuse of this trust, means that our lives come to us as a gift and that we have a fundamental duty to take care of each other. And the longer quotes from him are on the handout that I hope you all have. And the reason I did them as a handout rather than as a PowerPoint was so that you would have something to take home with you. And be able to look up the two books that are available. The other person must, to such a degree, be dependent upon me that what I do and say in the relationship between us, I alone and nobody else, here and now, and not at some other time or in some other manner, is of decisive importance. If my relation to the other person is the place where my relation to God is determined, then it must at the same time be the place where that person's existence is so totally at stake that to fail him is to fail him irreparably. This morning we heard from Simone about vulnerability. You'll hear, those of you who were there will recognize some overlap here. Immediately we hear an unusual voice, clear, straightforward, uncompromising, without philosophical or theological jargon. And yet this clarity carries an implicated message. And I say implicated rather than implied because he's talking about an accusation. It implicates me, as if in a crime, if I haven't responded or held the other's trust. He called the ethical demand silent because it comes to us without words in two senses. Unspoken but implicit in all conversation, the other's dependence on me means I must not mistreat or abandon this raw vulnerability. Regardless of how varied the communication between persons may be, he wrote, it always involves the risk of one person daring to lay himself or herself open to the other in the hope of a response. That's worth, pausing over. Every time we speak, we lay ourselves vulnerable, open to a very serious rejection. There is self-surrender in all forms of communication, he said. Our vulnerability to the other generates preemptive shame, keeping the ethical demand silent. Quote, it must at all costs never become apparent to the other person, and preferably not even to ourselves, that it is a matter of disappointed expectation, because though we have been exposed, we are at pains not to admit it. We would much rather admit blemishes and weaknesses, mistakes and stupidities, than admit to having laid ourselves open. Unquote. The silent demand, though it commands response, does not specify its content, but leaves each of us to work that out. Like the humanitarians to whom nurse educator Jean Watson recommends both Leuchtrup and Levinas, the recipient of the demand must find its content in the context. An ethical response, one that takes care of the vulnerability of the other, differs depending on the age of the child, the illness and capacities of the patient, the resources of the surrounding world, and the precarity, Judith Butler's recent work foregrounds. This morning we heard that there's a difference between protecting vulnerability and protecting and defending against vulnerability. This is about protecting vulnerability. The demand remains silent on its content, but it does not permit or exonerate bystanding. Though the ethical demand remains silent and pervasively implicit, still Leuchtrup insists on its radicality, not in words and actions, but in the demand itself. This ethics requires that what I do and say in relation to the other be done unselfishly, for the sake of the other. And here are more quotes that are on your page. The demand, precisely because it is unspoken, is radical. This is true even though the thing to be done in any particular situation may be very insignificant. Why is this? Because the person confronted by the unspoken demand must himself or herself determine how he or she is to take care of the other person's life. If what he or she does is to result in something of real value to the other person, he or she must think and act unselfishly. The radicality of the demand consists further in the fact that it asks me to take care of the other person's life, not only when to do so strengthens me, but also when it is very unpleasant because it intrudes disturbingly into my own existence. And this is not all. Even in distrust, the other person is still delivered over into my hands. Even my enemy is to a large degree dependent upon me and upon the manner in which I respond to him or her. Finally, he concludes, as if he had studied Levinas on the ethical constitution of subjectivity, The demand has the effect of making the person to whom the demand is directed a singular person. Ethically speaking, the demand isolates him or her, like puts you right on the hot seat. I respond, therefore I am. He notes that we are not required to, quote, turn ourselves inside out, to abandon all spiritual reticence. Does that sound like a Scandinavian Lutheran? Rather, we must protect the life of the other who has been delivered over into our hands. Lordship cautions that our responsibility for the other does not mean taking over the responsibility for the other's own responsibilities. He further cautions that mistaking radical responsibility for limitlessness can easily lead us to encroach on the other in the name of taking care. The radicality of the demand may require us to do less than radical actions. That's an interesting thing to think about clinically. The demand is, thirdly, one-sided because it can claim nothing in return. It is, if as Lordstrup took as axiomatic, my life is a gift, Levinas would say, we are created. I have nothing to which I am entitled. I possess nothing that I have not received, and cannot, as he said, make counter demands. Quote, a person is a debtor not because he or she has committed some wrong, but simply because he or she exists and has received his or her life as a gift. The demand that he or she take care of the other person's life, is rooted in the very fact of his or her indebtedness for all the different potentialities he or she has him or herself received. Intelligence, speech, love, and many others. Probably the he or she was added by the translator. This is old enough it wouldn't have been gender neutral. Some will object, Lordstrup knew, to characterizing life as a gift, especially in the face of suffering and death, loss and despair. But he concludes, the thing that makes us dispute that life is a gift is not death or suffering. It is our own will to be worshipped and feel our own power. He notes, however, that suffering becomes bearable only if others support life as a gift. I am reminded of Levinas' eloquent description in Totality and Infinity of the non-demanding caress. One-sidedness, the demand's third trait, shows up most clearly when the other feels less like a gift and more like a nuisance. It is when we regard him or her as something entirely other than a gift, because he or she is a bother and an inconvenience to us. The demand that we nevertheless take care of his or her life is therefore directed to us on the presupposition that our own life has been given to us as a gift. Through the demand, we are asked whether we intend to make ourselves masters of our own life to the point of deciding for ourselves who shall and shall not be a part of it, or whether we will accept our life as a gift in order to use it for taking care of the other person's life. So the question of reciprocity, what does the other owe to me, receives the same answer from Lordstrup as from Levinas. That is his affair. My only concern is that the other comes first. The common or divergent sources of their convictions on this one-sidedness or asymmetry would make a larger study than I can undertake here. Both equally opposed any social contract ethics based on reciprocity or mutual recognition. And last, the demand is impossible or unfulfillable because it so seems to contradict our acquired selfishness. The demand is further impossible because we can never know whether we truly acted unselfishly. The demand does not tell us how we are to take care of the other. Sometimes the other would seem to prefer to be left in the rubble, but that we must take care. Nor can we know if we have done enough. Lordstrup acknowledges that the demand sometimes involves us in knotty problems of thinking we know better, like a parent of grown-up children, for example, what is good for the other, but insists that these problems cannot allow us to become bystanders. The Good Samaritan is Lordstrup's model. The ethical demand does not prescribe exactly what we who observe injustice should do. It requires that we respond and leaves us all the problems of practical wisdom. The needs are infinite and we are not. We thus live divided between the demand and our possibilities. He doesn't actually take up the question of our participation in injustice, but he certainly implies that if we don't respond to injustice, we are participants in it. Though his emphasis on trust could seem to place Lordstrup among the promise-keeping Kantians, his ethics utterly transcends a calculus of what we owe to each other based on any kind of social contract. He describes instead a radical vulnerability into which we are born and in which we live. Trust, he wrote, is essential to every conversation. In conversation as such, we deliver ourselves over into the hand of another, he wrote. He continues, what happens is that simply in addressing the other, irrespective of the importance of the content of what we say, a certain note is struck, through which we, as it were, step out of ourselves in order to exist in the speech relationship. For this reason, the point of the demand, though unarticulated, is that the speaker is accepted.
Check.
Is there something wrong with this?
Somebody else seems to be on the same frequency, so. Switch.
They're making an ethical demand. Is this, can you hear me? No?
No, it's just gotta turn it on. It's okay, I just have to turn it on.
He's turning it on.
Proceed.
Is it on now?
No.
No.
It is on, it's just very low.
Oh,
I'll adjust that.
okay. Now it's good?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, there are plenty of these papers. If anybody else missing one? Here, please. My printer went a little wild on this. Okay, let's see where we were. Oh, we're in the middle of that quote. Okay. For this reason, the point of the demand, though unarticulated, is that the speaker is accepted as the note struck by the speaker's address is accepted. For a person inadvertently or even intentionally not to hear the note in what we say, therefore means that it is we ourselves who are being ignored, provided it is we ourselves who dare to make the overture. That all speech takes place in such fundamental trust is evident in the fact that the most casual comment takes on a false note if one believes that it is not accepted in the sense that it is intended. Sometimes even in a conference like this, somebody says something into the discussion that nobody really understands. And someone needs to help to get that understood. Because, he goes on, that there is a sense that they've made themselves so vulnerable by taking the risk of speaking into the group to begin with. Parenthetically, we might note that misunderstandings and ruptures, therapeutic and in intimate relationships, occur when the other feels some important nuance unheard and trust therefore breached. The silent demand is to protect trust, the precondition for everything. Lordstrup's ethical philosophy, like that of Emmanuel Levinas, with whom he begs to be compared, mostly emerged from his reflections on the behavior of bystanders and of courageous people during the Nazi period. He wrote of the differences in ethical decision required in Norway and Denmark during World War II. In Denmark, he thought, the presence of a government that persisted between the people and the Nazis meant time for deliberation. In Norway, with nothing but Nazi government, people constantly faced radical choices where protecting the vulnerable meant immediate risk of death or concentration camp for themselves or their families. This meant, Luther thought, that their previous patterns of response to the ethical demand would probably predominate in their choices to collaborate, resist, or protect the lives of vulnerable others. There is a psychic maturity, he wrote, which can make the direction of many an instant decision a foregone conclusion. Even when much is at stake, a person need not therefore necessarily be in doubt about what he or she will do. Although we may in our present moment still have time to deliberate, to sleep on it, I find it useful to realize that every choice I make may be preparing a direction for fiercer challenges. Luther himself, by the way, involved himself in much more active and dangerous resistance to the Nazi occupiers than many of his Danish colleagues were willing to do. Two further aspects of Luther's thinking helped to make his radicality clear. First, he raged, as much as his reserved philosophical voice would let him, against Kierkegaard, dearly beloved ancestor of so many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s with existentialism. In his view, Kierkegaard, putting away Regina Olsen and his love for her, focused much too much on his own purity of heart. In Luther's view, ethics has little to do with how holy and pure the individual can become. Now, his critique is far more extensive than that, but that gives you a nugget of the flavor of it. Further, in the years after his most famous book, Luther wrote of what he called, quote, sovereign expressions of life. This odd-sounding phrase refers to qualities of relatedness, he might have said character traits, like sincerity, trust, and mercy, characterizing response to the ethical demand, but contrasting with obsessive and self-enclosed phenomena, including betrayal, jealousy, and envy. Much of Luther's later work involved describing these contrasts, so neglected, he thought, by Kierkegaard and by conventional moral philosophy. Emanuel Levinas, born in Lithuania in 1906, 1 year later, student and early admirer of Heidegger, came to mount an ethical and phenomenological critique of what he called totalizing, every form of reducing people to things or categories, a tendency he found both violent and endemic to the Western tradition. From the time Hitler came to power, with Heidegger enthusiastically endorsing him, Levinas contrasted this murderous totalizing with response and responsibility to infinity and transcendence, to the face of the other, commanding me, accusing me. This is a horribly condensed and oversimplified account. Presentiment and memory of the Nazi horror, he wrote, haunted all his work. In his second great book, Substitution, The Other's Life Before Mine, The Other's Death of More Concern Than Mine, takes center stage. Ethical saying, hineni, me here, yes, replaces the objectifying, categorizing said, now treating the naked and vulnerable other as of ultimate value. The face of the other now bears the trace of the infinite, and only in the other can the infinite be found. So how do these true thinkers of radical ethics compare and contrast? Rooted in religion, Lutheran and Jewish, respectively, both intended to work as phenomenologists, but picked up different strains. Influenced by Bergson, Husserl, and Heidegger, both lived at the same times in Strasbourg, and we just determined that that's not true. It's a mistake here. Levinas was there a little earlier. Where Levinas was teaching when Luther arrived as a student. I think that's almost true, but not quite. Anyway, they seem never to have met. And although they may have been in Freiburg at the same time, because they both wanted to hear Heidegger. Where Levinas developed his phenomenology by inverting Husserlian intentionality The other faces and accuses me. Luhrdrup studied with Hans Lipp in Göttingen, absorbing the Heideggerian being in the world conviction, but following this being into ethical relatedness. Our very situatedness with others creates the ethical demand. Heideggerian thrownness became for Luhrdrup basic trust, only destroyed by betrayal and trauma. Luhrdrup, though neither novelist nor poet, often illustrated his ethical concepts with relational stories, creating a type of narrative phenomenology is what I might call it. And I can give you an example here. At 4 o'clock in the morning, there is an insistent ring at the door. When the woman descends, the secret police are outside, demanding that she open up. Once inside, they ask for her husband. They are informed that, as it happens, he is not at home, but away on business. One of the two men, the subordinate, heavily armed, ugly as sin, and looking capable of every kind of brutality, starts searching the house. The other, possessed of an engaging manner, all amiability and courtesy, is talking to the woman meanwhile and assuring her that the visit is of no consequence, merely a routine procedure. The woman acts obligingly, appearing surprised, a composed and polished performance. She is perfectly aware that his charming insistence on the insignificance of their visit is aimed solely at getting her to talk, and is not taken in by anything that he says. She knows that from the least unconsidered remark, ammunition will be forged for use against her husband and herself. In spite of that, and this is probably the oddest part of the whole business, she needs constantly to rein in an inclination to talk to the man as to another human being, as though he might be drawn from his destructive enterprise to properly human perceptions and good sense. Unremittingly, she must keep a cool head. Why? What manifests itself in that inclination? Nothing other than the elemental and definitive peculiarity attaching to all speech qua spontaneous expression of life, its openness. To speak is to speak openly. So you get a sense of how he develops and illustrates with stories. Here we have a good example of phenomenological description in Luhrdrup's hands. The basic thrust exerts an almost instinctual hold. He justified his view of the ethical demand and of the sovereign expressions of life on grounds of experiences with which the reader or hearer could easily identify. Levinas, directly Heidegger's student, but even earlier a translator and student of Husserl, found another phenomenological voice. The self is a subjectum. It is under the weight of the universe. The unity of the universe is not what my gaze embraces in its unity of apperception, but what is incumbent on me from all sides. It regards me, it is my affair. Here we find a prophetic voice challenging the whole philosophical tradition. The first-person perspective, so beloved by phenomenologists, finds itself no longer agentic, no longer the constructor of experience, but subject as subjected, under the weight of incumbency, obligated from all sides, more passive than all passivity. Because Levinas outlived Luhrdrup into the digital age, we have additional access to his distinctive voice in the form of interviews from his later years, easily accessible to all of us. Look on YouTube. We can hear him repeat the importance of returning to texts, and like a mantra, la sortie du soi, la sortie du soi, the exit from self. The exit from self. Each thinker describes a radical ethical demand of responsibility to care for the vulnerable other in his own idiom. Phenomenologists both thinkers challenge what Critchley names the autonomy orthodoxy of Western moral theory. Both describe ethical experience rather than justifying ethical choices afterwards. Both, in addition, I wrote, share a Judeo-Christian sensibility, and Claire's going to take me up on that a little bit, and I'm very, very grateful. That needs to be taken up. Phenomenology gives them a secular language, one might say, for communicating their radical ethics in human terms. Raised in an intellectual strain of Judaism in Kovno, Lithuania, and ever allergic to more mystical forms, then profoundly educated in Russian literature and exile in Ukraine in his gymnasium years, and in phenomenology in Europe with Husserl and Heidegger, Levinas emerged from 5 years in captivity during the war to study Talmud with the famous Chuchani, also the teacher of Elie Wiesel. Headmaster of a Jewish school, NEO, in Paris, he gave weekly Rashi commentaries and produced Talmudic commentaries, which I love to read, published with different publisher from his philosophical work. These, as well as his explicitly philosophical works, show a fascinating interdisciplinary voice and resistance to theologizing. Luchtrup, for his part, began his best-known work, The Ethical Demand, by framing its purpose as making the basic message of Jesus, love thy neighbor, accessible in human terms. Critchley, rightly in my view, hears Luchtrup throughout, glossing Matthew 5:43-7 from the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do that? And if you salute only your brethren, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do that? How many times should I forgive my brother? 70 times 7. And Claire's going to take that one up too. That's an interesting conversation. A radical, one-sided, unfulfillable demand like the Levinasian ethic, this inordinate, excessive demand seems to echo, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. But Luchtrup did not quote these words. The biblical words I just read you, he did not quote. Educated in theology and philosophy, he, like Levinas, avoided theologizing, preferring description and narrative of ethical experience. As Hans Fink and Alistair McIntyre write in their introduction to The Ethical Demand, Luchtrup did indeed take the ethical demand to be that which was commanded by Jesus when he repeated the injunction of Leviticus to love our neighbor as ourselves. But for Luchtrup, the ethical demand is not laid upon Christians rather than non-Christians. There is no Christian morality and secular morality. There is only human morality. He saw people living out their acceptance of the ethical demand in the present and struggling with it. Levinas would speak of a split in subjectivity, with the demand originating in the immemorial past, a demand to which I am always inadequate, thus torn apart by it. In Judith Butler's straightforward words, let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. For both thinkers, Western religious sensibility grounded and shaped what they came to understand as the human ethical relation. How much either would be able to engage in interfaith dialogues beyond their partially shared traditions remains for me an open question. Both profoundly challenged the individualism underlying Western ontologies, colonialism, and other forms of reductive and murderous violence. Luchtrup substituted trust, Levinas solidarity, I think. Both seem close to Buddhist compassion and to African Ubuntu, though to my knowledge neither mentioned these ideas. A striking similarity between these two thinkers, absent from other major moral philosophers, is one-sidedness or asymmetry. The ethical demand is on me, not you. This stupefying, excessive, exorbitant quality defies the logic of justification. Only stories demonstrate its possibility and even reasonableness. But I must mention that in his last years, Levinas tended to call these examples of the ethical response holiness. Luchtrup, more reserved, thought they simply demonstrated true humanity. Maybe this is a good place to stop, so there will be time for conversation.
Okay, now we will hear Claire Katz's response. Claire Katz is currently the Murray and Celeste Baskin Chair of Distinguished Teaching and Professor of Philosophy at Texas A&M. She teaches and conducts research at the intersection of philosophy, Jewish studies, and gender studies. She is the author of 3 monographs, Levinas, Judaism and the Feminine, The Silent Footsteps of Rebecca, Levinas and the Crisis of Humanism, An Introduction to Modern Jewish Philosophy, and the editor with Laura Trout of Emmanuel Levinas Critical Assessments, volumes 1 through 4. Her articles have appeared in Telos, Jewish Thought and Philosophy, the Journal of French and Francophone Studies, and Shofar. Most recently, she's returned to her early work in the Philosophy for Children program and an Education to Educator workshop. She runs a 1-week philosophy camp for teens and tweens. Claire.
Do I have to use this?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to thank Donna, first of all, for allowing me to respond to her paper. It was interesting to see these 2 thinkers put together, and we were both talking about how it's just so strange that they never met, and if you were to take some of, not all, but some of their passages out of context, there's games you see on BuzzFeed, who said this, Hitler or Trump or something like that. You might not know whether it was Levinas or Luchtrup who said it. So with that said, I'm going to start. So I tend to be a rebel in some things, but I try to abide by time allotted to me. So I try to stay to my 10 minutes in responding to Donna's paper. So there are many things I don't get to that hopefully we can talk about in the discussion. Okay, so as I said, I've attempted to keep my paper to the 10 plus minutes, and I would like to be sure to leave time for Donna's paper for discussion, which will certainly generate a lively discussion. So first I want to thank Donna for writing an inspiring paper that provoked a multitude of questions occupying my thought since I first received her paper in July. As Donna indicates in her paper, there is surprising and considerable overlap between the ethical thought of the French Jewish philosopher Levinas and the ethical thought of Luchtrup, a Danish Lutheran philosopher born just 1 year before Levinas was born. Looking at their work through various quotes and phrases, one might have trouble discerning to which philosopher the passage originated if this identification had not been made beforehand. These apparent similarities ask us to consider, on the one hand, if the similarity in thought might also yield a similar set of problems for each thinker. Several of these problems are better known within Levinas circles, and I would be curious to know if they apply also to Luchtrup. On the other hand, I wonder if that closer look at the 2 philosophers might reveal some nuanced differences. That is, are the similarities only apparent? In my brief response to Donna's paper, I would first like to look at the problems that haunt Levinas's work, consider how some of these are resolved within his project, and ask if these problems also haunt Luchttrup's project. If they do, it would be interesting to see how they are dealt with for him. I would then like to turn to the particular ways that I think Levinas differs from Luchtrup and consider what those differences mean for the respective projects. And I just want to say, Don and I were talking about this earlier, that they never met. I'm looking at the dates. It looks like Luchtrup followed a similar path to Levinas, but way after him. So by 1930, Levinas had already returned to Paris and was working at the Alliance. And that seems to be when Luchtrup actually started on his path to Strasbourg and Freiburg and so forth. So they're sort of like ships kind of passing, like, like a Hallmark movie or something that they didn't quite intersect. But they do have a similar lineage, which might be the way to trace some of these similarities. So Bergson seems to be a similar point of similarity for them, but also Jean Herring, who they both seem to have taken classes with. So there seems to be a similarity in who taught them, and that might account for some, but certainly not all. I mean, certainly not the idiosyncratic things that we attribute to Levinas in particular. Okay. As Donna indicates, both Lookstrup and Levinas describe an ethical project that invokes the conventional ethical theories provided by Western philosophy. We are not agents who are then responsible to live up to a moral or legal code. Rather, we become agents or subjects because we are claimed by the other. The claim is not something I choose, nor is it something I can refuse, even as I can refuse to act on that claim. And there are questions about whether that's true in Levinas's work. So I would slightly alter what Donna said about I respond, therefore I am, but I am claimed, therefore I am. We are singular in our responsibility. The claim is not issued through speech. That is, the claim is not mediated. No one can stand in for us. Neither of these ethical projects is utilitarian in any of its formulations. Rather, each focuses on the singular other person. Neither provides a set of rules by which we are to guide our lives, nor does either adhere to a Kantian system that would include an overarching moral guide, like the categorical imperative. Neither provides a mechanism for generating any particular set of rules. As a result, neither indicates that any particular transgression would be categorically wrong, with one caveat. The ethics each describes as asymmetrical. The claim made only by the other cannot be said to obligate the other. That is his affair. That we find features that we would consider unique to Levinas in Lookstrup's ethical project is extraordinary. But here's where I wish to draw out some of the problems that haunt Levinas and consider whether they may or may not be found in Lookstrup's work. For Levinas, the one demand made by the face of the other is thou shalt not kill. So that's the one caveat I would make to some particular thing that claims me. It is the claim made on me that emanates from the other. The phenomenology offered in both totality, infinity, and otherwise than being, and I do read these books on a kind of continuum, provide the descriptions for what this claim is like, what it means to be a subject claimed by the other in this way. The problem is that for phenomenology, the description must cohere with one's experience. What happens to the phenomenology when someone says, that is not how I experience the other? I do not feel this claim impinge on me. And this is said repeatedly in response to Levinas's work by, in particular, other philosophers. Do we respond with, but the claim is present nonetheless, indicating that the ethical claim on a person has a particular metaphysical status? This common response to Levinas has been effective at undermining the claim that the phenomenological description is general or applies beyond Levinas's description of himself as the I. So if the claim made by the other stands, whether or not I experience it as such, then where does it come from? Where is the power or the warrant for the claim that the other comes before me? What imbues it with this power? This particular complaint haunts Levinas's ethical project, which relies on the phenomenology to extend the claim beyond himself. I think Levinas's project addresses this complaint through his pervasive appeal to religion, and so this may actually be, ironically, a point of distinction between them, but also it's what separates me from a lot of the other people who work on Levinas. An appeal that is greatly downplayed in much of the secondary literature. We can come back to this point in the discussion, but in short, I want to ask what this means for Lookstrup. Where is the warrant for the claim he is making? When one moves to an ethics that is not based on something pragmatic or rational, what grounds it? Related to the problem I just described is the move from an ethical subject that is a self-centered ego to an ethical subject that becomes an ethical subject through the other. Donna, in her paper, refers to the former as acquired selfishness. Here again, there might be something interestingly in common between Levinas and Lookstrup, if the claim is that we learn to be self or ego-centered. My own reading of Levinas has altered dramatically because of this particular conundrum. How do we become the radical subject that Levinas describes? We can find one answer in Levinas's focus on Jewish education. Although Levinas abides by the Midrashic tradition in his reading of the biblical stories, there is once again one non-negotiable, one theme that for him is not subject to Midrashic interpretation. The aim of the stories, all of the stories that he reads and comments on, is to turn us toward the other. That ethical lesson is the one lesson that remains constant. He reads every biblical story, indeed much of all literature, through that one ethical lesson. Human subjectivity emerges from ethical responsibility for the other, and for him, Jewish education begins here. The aim is to parent and teach, often the same thing for him, so that the child puts the other first. The problem I encountered when working on this particular interpretive problem was not that others outside Judaism could not be ethical subjects in a Levinasian sense. Rather, the question is, what would be comparable to Jewish education for achieving this end? Okay, so now the differences. And here I really want to focus on one central difference with multiple rays emanating from it. I might be unique, but I do not read Levinas's ethics as specific, nor do I read him as infinitely forgiving. I am actually not sure that forgiveness plays a role in his ethical project. It is significant that in Otherwise Than Being, Levinas references Lamentations when he refers to the turning outward of the cheek, as opposed to Matthew, which advocates the turning of the other cheek. In Levinas's version, the turning of the cheek outward is the signal of vulnerability, ethics. In Matthew's, the turning of the other cheek is pacifism. I would consider the turning of the other cheek a move to politics. Toward the end of the paper, Donna tells us that Lookstrup begins the ethical demand by framing its purpose as making the basic message of Jesus, love thy neighbor, accessible in human terms. Both she and Simon Critchley see Lookstrup echoing the Gospel of Matthew throughout the text. Although both Levinas and Lookstrup are inspired by their respective religious traditions, Judaism and Christianity, the two traditions, in spite of our continued reference to the Judeo-Christian tradition, are very different from each other. Although Matthew has many similarities to Judaism, and for those of you who work in that area, there are obvious reasons why that's the case, the differences are not only significant, but also at times anti-Jewish. In the discussion of forgiveness, Donna references Matthew 18:21, where Peter asks Jesus, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times, and Jesus answers, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, pointing to an infinite forgiveness. In his 1963 Talmudic reading, Toward the Other, Levinas explicitly complicates forgiveness. He presented this essay as part of the Colloque of Intellectual Juif. That year's theme was on forgiveness with a particular eye toward forgiving the Germans. He begins with the Mishnah passage about the Jewish Day of Atonement. The transgressions of man toward God are forgiven him by the Day of Atonement. The transgressions against other people are not forgiven him by the Day of Atonement if he has not first appeased the other person. From a metaphysical perspective, within Judaism, murder is unforgivable as a matter of fact, and also, I hesitate to use the word theology, but as a matter of theology within Judaism, since only those against whom one has transgressed can offer forgiveness. The murder victim is incapable of doing this, and since the murderer cannot first appease the victim, the murderer cannot be forgiven by God. We do violence to the victim, but we forgive when it is not our place to forgive. There are also acts that are unforgivable. The arguments made by Derrida and Jankelevich notwithstanding, for Levinas there must also be this limit where we render forgiveness meaningless. Justice must have its place. The world is often bloody and grotesque and inhumane, and many of these acts are not to be forgiven. The ethical message of unlimited and infinite forgiveness in Christianity does not easily overlap with the ethical message of Judaism, which occasionally views forgiveness as precisely not ethical. Thus, while we find terms like passivity throughout Otherwise Than Being, the passivity is the passivity of being utterly claimed by the other within the context of ethical obligation. It is not, I don't think, and I'm happy to be corrected here, a turn toward pacifism. Levinas does not tell us that what we ought to do in response to that claim. It is the political, the realm of action that complicates or frustrates the ethical. and that political realm might call for an action that is much different from forgiveness. My aim here has been to open up the similarities that Donna rightly draws our attention to in these two projects. My hope is that by opening up these similarities, we're in a better position to investigate them. So it is here that I will stop and turn the discussion back to Donna and to you all. And I just want to say, just as a, because there's just so many things going on in Donna's paper that were interesting and interesting overlaps, that when I was looking through the look strip book, one of the things that's really interesting is his commentary on Eros, which is also something that Levinas focuses on as well. And there are interesting points of intersection, both in similarity and differences between them, and the ways in which each thinks about the relationship between something like Eros, for example, and ethics, which is unusual, I think, for two philosophers. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. It's just another point of discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your engagement with this, and it's just the beginning of what could be a much longer conversation, obviously. I just want to say a couple things really quickly, because I'd rather hear from all of you. One is that I personally incline toward the Jewish point of view about forgiveness. So in that, I don't believe that I have a right to forgive things that were done to you. I think it's only up to me to decide whether I forgive things that were done against me. And so that's a whole discourse that we could get into. But and so that's I would take your side on that one for sure. It's very interesting to ask what grounds both of these ethics. What actually grounds them? And what we were talking about this morning with Simone, and I think in some place I was yesterday as well, the conversations here are amazing, is that perhaps our ordinary idea of grounding of an ethic isn't quite the right question to put to either one of these thinkers. That a pre-primordially, it is as if these thinkers took Heidegger's thrownness and transformed it into the idea that we are born with a capacity to be turned toward the other. Not only that, I mean, this is what this kind of anarchical ethic has to do with, and that through through later life experiences and lack of good education, we screw it up. But that it isn't that good parenting and good education actually create the ethical child, but that they bring that out in a sense. What is I think both of these thinkers think that what is truly natural to us is the ethical response. And I may be wrong about that, and we've got a couple of much more serious ethical Levinas scholars that are sort of at your level in this room, so we may be able to hear more about that. There are a lot of other things here that would be great fun to talk about, but I'd rather hear from other people that are here in the room. So who would like to say something?
Oh, we can't have silenced you.
I'll try something again.
Good, thank you.
I guess one point I'm picking up is exactly the point that you ended with, Donna, and it's something that Claire mentioned. So this question of how do we become ethical subjects? in Levinas's sense, because, I mean, my own sense is also that.
Yes, but can you talk a little bit more close to the microphone?
Right. My own sense is also that we forget how to be ethical subjects. There's this difference between, well, this morning I talked about the self and the ego. And so it is that sense of being born, I suppose, as in relation to others, for the other, with the other, in relation to the other. And then it's the question of what gets in the way of that. I mean, as you both know, this idea of ethics as first philosophy, and then what happens that somehow gets in the way of that allows us to forget that ethics is first philosophy. So, I mean, that's just a comment. I guess the other question I have, and that comes from not knowing Luke Stropp's work at all, but it's kind of a question for you, Donna, in terms of, as a practitioner, who has, found much inspiration in Levinas's work, where would you see, an engagement with Luke Stropp's work would lead you as a practitioner?
Thank you for giving me both a microphone and a minute to think about such big questions. I've been thinking Levinas for so many years of my clinical life now that I've been working on this since I retired from clinical work, so it hasn't got into my clinical bones to the same degree. But I think the question of vulnerability and the extent to which I have often thought that when someone comes in to see me with what I call troubles, whatever they may be troubling them, they sort of place their soul in my hands in a gesture, even if they would not feel themselves, they might feel themselves to be very distrustful because they've been hurt so badly, and in so many different ways. But in fact, the very act of seeking help and speaking to someone about their troubles is an act of unbelievable vulnerability. And it seems to me that Luchtrup attunes us to the vulnerability in speaking to each other, but then it also is true that when I attempt to speak back to the other, I'm making myself vulnerable too. And so there's a lot of vulnerability in the clinical situation that we are kind of counting on the other to take care of. And when either person treats that with contempt or disregard, there's something terrible that happens. The thing is that I do believe with Buber and implicitly with Levinas and Luchtrup that the clinician has an outsized responsibility here, that it's way asymmetrical. But there is some responsibility in every communicative situation to treat the other with care. And I think that that's one of the things that he makes really clear. What's also lovely about this is the response is unspecified. It doesn't tell me what exactly I am supposed to do. And it may not be, and a lot of his work is directed to discussing this. It may not be what the other person particularly wants me to do. I'm still left with all the questions of practical wisdom, the kinds of things that are incumbent on parents and teachers, parents particularly when their children want things that you know are dangerous for them at that age. And your responsibility is to say no, not yet, or whatever it is. All that kind of thing, that the radical responsibility doesn't mean giving the other person exactly what they want. And that would also be true in the clinical situation. We can't always do that. We get in all kinds of trouble if we think that radical ethics means just giving people whatever they want from us. So Lipstrup's reflections sort of do have some clinical helpful stuff. He's a down-to-earth, practical, kind of non-jargon guy. I think there's a lot more depth in Levinas, but there's a lot of help in Lipstrup too.
Anybody else? Does that help a little bit?
As just a consumer, I suppose, of these ideas and how much Levinas breathes life into the deadness of Heidegger, okay, and to feel like, oh, there's something as a clinician I can really understand. So I would like to know more about the problem with his statement as a foundational statement, and I'm probably being quite inarticulate, but I'd be very reluctant to say that the foundation would be what sounds like a Rousseauan view that the child is born moral and ethical. And I don't know you're saying it, but that's sort of what I heard, and and so if the child is not born ethical, then what is the foundation? And I was hoping for a better answer, but I thought you had one.
Here,
Let me try one more, slightly more sophisticated response, and then appeal to the philosophers in the room to help me. I want to say that there's a kind of transcendental grounding that the capacity or the self-turn toward the other prior to all this development of egoism is the condition for the possibility of an ethical life, an ethical response. If it is as if Levinas, I don't know whether he ever argues it exactly like this, but it is as if Levinas said, here are these instances of substitution, of generosity, of holiness, of whatever he wants to call it. What makes this possible in the face of the fact that the person who's being so generous is also suffering? That I may be asked to give my last crust of bread so the other one can live. It's all the way from letting the other go through the door first to, he talks about snatching the bread out of your mouth. Some of the passages in Otherwise Than Being, and in that substitution chapter, will give you nightmares, if you really, really take them in. And he's essentially saying, and Robert has written about this in a remarkable piece called What is the Question to Which Substitution is the Answer? What is that? What makes it possible for people in Houston whose own houses are destroyed to take their boat and go rescue other people? You see instances of astonishing goodness in the world. And I don't know whether those people are that good all the time, but it happens. And you got to say, why is that possible? And the question of why is that possible is what is the condition for the possibility of such and so happening, that philosophers call that a transcendental argument. Maybe some of the philosophers can help me here.
yeah. Did you, somebody else, did that help?
Did that help a little bit?
Yes, please.
So I have the same worry. I mean, that's, and I appreciate your your question about Rousseau, because I actually think that that is, I mean, he's both the beginning and the end in some sense of how we think, well, how we think about education, child-centered education, the so-called natural child, you know, all of those things come into play. But the word that I have, so on the one hand, I agree with Donna that, and Robert, I think would probably say something, would say something similar to Donna, that I'm asking the wrong question. But I don't know that I'm asking the wrong question, and that you are either. I think that, and I guess it's from having gone to so many conferences and hearing so many papers and so many people saying, what if I don't experience the ethical that way? And I think that that's the problem with phenomenology, is that it's supposed to cohere with your experience, and as soon as that person comes along and says, that's not my experience, then we either have to say there's something wrong with you, or it transcends this in a way that actually gives it a kind of metaphysical, in the old-fashioned sense of that term, place in the world, and that does not seem to be where Levinas is going with this. So, some of the best arguments I've seen for where it comes from, for me, they are great at establishing intersubjectivity as a ground, but not the ethical relationship that comes with intersubjectivity. That to me is the sticking point, that the best arguments I've seen can get you partway, right, but not to the actual ethical, and not as Levinas is describing it. And so the other thing that struck me is that I did so much work on Levinas's essays on Jewish education that I thought, he can't be spilling all of this ink for no reason. It means something to him, and the way that education works for him within Jewish education has this ethical import, the Havrota relationship, which is a partnered relationship, a community relationship within Judaism, and the way that he reads those Talmudic stories, as well as the stories in the Bible, he's inverting how Westerners understand education. So the problem I came up against when I was working through this was, that works, but it's really hard as a parent and a teacher to try to enact that within Western culture. So that's, I mean, and I've tried this, like with my own kids, give your lunch money away, I mean, it's difficult to think about like what it would really mean. Well, in the context of a Jewish community, you can do that. And that, when he raises these questions, it's clear that this is what's going on for him within the context of Judaism. The question is, how do you translate that into a non-Jewish terms? And he does that with the philosophical work, but he doesn't with how you start that process. He answers it for the Jewish audience. There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I could probably argue with Robert about this, so Robert's probably trying to disavow me as one of his students. But I think that he's very clear about the sort of origins of this within the Jewish community. He doesn't provide, and I think for good reason, he doesn't provide the so-called origins of this for the non-Jewish community. He gives you the philosophical. So I agree. I think it's a problem.
George Bernard Shaw's ethical position was, the thief who steals from me, I have no business having him arrested or put into prison. But if he steals from me the second time, I shoot him. That was his ethical policy.
That's Peter.
Yes, I really enjoyed, I learn all the time from Donna, just listening to it about LogScript now, and I really enjoyed this. I had a question of fact, and then I had, and it's related to the whole clinical situation that Donna brought up about asymmetry, and which I'm interested in. Whether, first of all, whether Levinas or LogScript ever wrote about psychotherapy or psychoanalysis directly. That's one question. And then it's related to the whole thing about what Donna said about the demand, and which I agree with. I think that part of the reason is that the patient comes in a very vulnerable situation to us, asking for help. But I'm wondering what Levinas would say about what happens to the ethical demand for the patient from the at Levinas's point of view? Because this is a kind of ethical demand for human beings. And the patient is a human being. And I partly see the hierarchical difference between, in power, between the analyst and patient coming and deriving from a kind of ethical privilege that the analyst has to fulfill the ethical demand. There's an opportunity to give help, to provide help, to respond. So it's not just an ethical demand. There's a challenge that, if fulfilled, becomes a kind of ethical privilege, and which I think translates into a feeling of power, because it makes one feel good. It just reverberates back. It can't help but reverberate back if you maybe fulfill that ethical demand. I know we were talking about selflessness before, the demand. So the motivation is selfless, but the outcome inadvertently may be a kind of feeling good about oneself, because giving to one and being received allows one to feel good. So it seems to me that the fulfillment and the opportunity to fulfill the ethical demand in psychotherapy, in analysis by all of us practitioners, becomes a kind of power that I think that patients don't have as much, partly because they're not in that position. They don't have, what do they have to offer that we accept? I know that besides often their suffering and their problems. So I think it's what Searles has said about treating the patient and the opportunity of patients he's talked about the thwarting of psychotherapeutic strivings, has made patients sick, which in a sense would mean that they have lost their natural ethical opportunity to fulfill that demand, and that's partly why they're sick. So I would just wanted to, the first question was more factual, but then I wanted to talk about this whole.
I get lost between the beginning and the end of your question sometimes, but I'll do the best I can here. Fortunately, we do at least some days and sometimes get some satisfaction out of our clinical work. And I am very grateful to have spent many years helping some people at least to have lives that were with less suffering. I'm grateful that I had the chance to do that for many years. But I would say that most days, every day, I got up having to remind myself that this was not about me and it was for the other. And that I hadn't better, just because yesterday was a good day, get too full of myself, because if I did, I was really going to screw up today. And that was usually what would happen too. Because I would be too confident at some moment and not really listen. Not really listen. I think that the ethical demand is not my favorite expression, but it's what he used, and it's much more this idea that the minute you open your mouth, you make yourself vulnerable to the person to whom you speak, and I back with you. I think it's a meditation on radical vulnerability and how we treat each other's vulnerability, and that never stops, no matter whether we do take some satisfaction in our work or not. It just never finishes, and it's just the same in the next hour and the next patient and the next day. I guess that's all I know really to say about what you're saying. I never got done with that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, and I know that your other question wasn't answered about whether either of them, either Longstreth or Levinas, wrote about psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. The answer is no. But I think that's part of the ethical dilemma of being a therapist, because to sit and not respond to the patient's suffering is also unethical. So in some ways, I think that's exactly what we have to sit with.
Elaine wants to say something.
Thank you all. This is really wonderful. One of the things that I think about a lot lately as a therapist, as a person, is the question of with whom do you breathe the freest emotionally? What person or people do you feel the freest? Do I feel the freest with? And I lately was saying to Peter that one of the things that means a lot to me is when very young people come into my office and talk what feels very freely about very personal and emotional things, as if I was in their, this isn't delusional, as if I was in their age group, but, that sense of just unconscious freedom and to talk without having to think, I wonder what she's going to think, is she going to be critical? So that, and I think it also takes us to the idea of with what people do we breathe the freest with? And what is it about the other that we breathe freely with that makes it possible for us? And how does that relate to our work?
Thank you for that, Elaine. And I feel sure that if I came to you, I would feel free.
Oh, thank you. Well,
Thank you. Answer this question. So the question about whether or not, I can't speak for Lookstruck, but there's an edited collection that came out, actually it's been a while now, almost maybe 20 years ago, called Levinas and Lacan, The Lost Connection, This Encounter. Levinas writes about dreams in Toward the Other, which is actually unusual given that he doesn't, in other places, say very positive things about psychoanalysis. So he wrote about it, but not, I think, in a kind of sustained way, but he references it, and I don't know if that's, you have your hand up. But.
You want to say something? Would you like to say something, Robert? I'd like you to. We'd be honored to have you say something.
No, you see, that's why I don't want to say anything, because you're assuming that I have something to say, but it seems to me that, I could say, Donna, that you were making an ethical demand of me, and I could say that in responding to it, I'm making myself vulnerable. And this seems to be the approach that you want to take. But I'm not so sure that when we look at it in those terms, we're talking about it in the way that Levinas is instructing us to think about it. And let me try to, with risk of greater oversimplification, there's a famous passage in an interview where Levinas, it's in Ethics and Infinity, he says what he's talking about is the possibility of ethics. He's not trying to give an ethics. And I think this is an important distinction for the kind of discussion we're having. In other words, when Claire asks about, the Jewish education, she's talking about an ethics, not the possibility of ethics. When you're talking about what is happening in the clinical situation, you're talking about the ethics that is associated with your own work as clinicians. You're not talking about what Levinas is talking about. There are the two sides to Levinas. There's one in which he, when confronted with the question, does ethics ever happen in your sense? He sort of says, it happens all the time. He gives an answer perhaps not unlike Donna's, which is why it's difficult for me to try and draw this distinction between the two positions. But it seems that the more typical approach of Levinas is simply to talk about, and this was a passage Simone quoted, about pity, compassion, the little there is. In other words, Levinas's vision is of a world dominated by anti-Semitism, National Socialism, suffering and violence. And the question he asks himself, this is a question with which Totality Infinity begins, is that all there is? And he's wanting to say, well, actually, there is another possibility. And if you believe in this other possibility, then you have to be able to account for it, and you're going to have an entirely different account of who we are. And that's what leads to substitution. And so I don't think he'd be terribly surprised if somebody said, well, I don't feel the claim of the other. He would say, well, yes, that's why the world is the way it is. But the question is, is that, does nobody ever feel the claim of the other? That's the question, it seems to me, that Levinas is asking. And he wants to say, well, if it does happen, then yes, then I is the other, then there is substitution. But I think he'd also say, and I think this goes very much to the question, the point you were making when you were sort of complicating the ethical situation of clinician by talking about the power and about wanting to do good and so on and so forth, and how that might make one feel if one wants to do good. I think his position is, it's certainly my position, is I see evil all around me. I'm never very sure if I see good. Even if you take those examples that you take, I think they're beautiful examples. I certainly want to believe that they're good. But do I know? And that is the point about goodness. You can never know goodness. It's beyond being, beyond knowledge.
We have a question.
Yeah, actually, a comment and sort of a question. It takes a very, very, very long time for a developing human being to get to the point where they can engage in conversation with another and really want to know what the otherness is well past adolescence. In fact, that's probably the end of adolescence, if there is an end of adolescence, if there is a place where we can really put ourselves aside to some degree or other and want to know otherness that really is different from me. And I think back to what Peter was saying, if I aspire to be ethical, I want to be ethical, I desire to be ethical, I have strong feelings inside of me that are going to be engaged in that, and in doing so, I never know when I'm really listening well or not. And do these two philosophers talk about the constant struggle to be ethical?
Well, they certainly talk about, as Robert just said, the fact that we don't know, both of them. And that's part of the deal, that we don't know. And there's never a point at which we've arrived and say, oh, today I'm ethical now. I've grown up into an ethical person. No. And that for one thing, where this discourse is proceeding on very different levels, as we just heard, and that's one whole thing. And ethical education or ethical development is kind of in your wheelhouse, as they say these days, and also in Claire's. How does one develop into an ethical person, knowing that you're never going to get there, and you're never going to know and Lordstrip makes a big point of the fact that I never know in any specific instance whether I have behaved, as he would say, unselfishly. I don't know myself well enough to know that. And that's part of what we live with. That's part of what he means by the demand being impossible. There are lots of unanswered questions here, and I'm very grateful for all of this discussion. I have not come down into settled opinions about much of any of this, but I find it extremely intriguing. And I'm very grateful for all your participation.
Okay, let's go have wine and cheese. Thank you both.